the world and the work of a photographer. It is so very often a combination of risk and reward. I can tell you that the risk is very much a promise. The promise that I can find the best shot. The promise that I can take the best shot. The promise that hopefully I will not accidentally erase or delete the shot on the way back to the studio. But very much the case that I also promise that I will weave these shots together into a story that will make you feel. The reward, of course. The reward is that I get to say that most elusive of phrases, I can't believe they are paying me to do this. And I've seen some remarkable sights along the way. Now lately, there's been a different risk, a different reward, a different challenge, but some of my favorite shots lately are the ones I have taken with very little sight at all. But I love those shots. Experiencing the changes in the atmosphere during that time of the day Australians call the pre-glow, the moments just before dawn in the outback. Hearing the etchings made by an Aborigine as he puts the finishing touches on the outline of a character 40,000 years in the making, a storybook in the sand. Feeling the way the wind rushes around the sail as it's being raised by a crew of blind sailors. Yes, I may be losing my sight, but I am maintaining a vision, one that has driven me for a very long time, to find and tell and share the stories of the people who are questioning perceptions, the people who are raising expectations, the people who are making a difference. I have not always had this certainty of purpose. On the day I traded in my driver's license for a bus pass, if not one of the darker, and certainly one of the dimmer days of my life, I didn't know anything about blind sailors, or bicyclists, or mountain climbers, or documentary filmmakers, my current profession. I also didn't know that the unemployment rate for working-age men and women who are visually impaired, people who can and want to work, is 70%. 70%. And I think I'm glad I didn't know that number, because what I was trying to do, merge these two worlds of visual storytelling and visual impairment, it certainly would have seemed like a one-way ticket to joining that unemployment line. But here it is some years later, and while I have indeed traded in that driver's license for the bus pass, I've not yet traded in the camera for the cane. The camera and the cane. How does that work? Now, a spoiler alert. I am not 100% blind yet, although that day does seem to be coming. My visual world right now, it's a world of shapes and shadows, of fogs and blurs, of streaks and smudges. It is not pretty, and it's certainly not reliable. What do I trust my eyes for when I'm shooting or when I'm directing? Nothing. Nothing at all. Now, this is the point where I'm usually expected to say something like, the other senses, they take over. And as my vision spiraled further downward, I was kind of looking forward to that. You know, there's even a comic book and a movie about just that kind of thing. It starred Ben Affleck, and I thought, this is going to be great. Blind attorney by day, crime fighter by night, I'm going to be able to fight crime. And Ben Affleck would be the one who plays me in the movie. That's a league I wouldn't mind being in. But the other senses taking over, it's a myth. In reality, blind people do not feel a person's face to see what they look like, and Daredevil, while he may be a blind attorney by day, because I do know plenty of blind attorneys, superhero crime fighter by night, no. That stays safely within the confines of the comic book pages and, let's be honest, Ben Affleck movies that are better left unmentioned. Now, the other senses don't take over. That said, you do learn to pay better attention to them, and that is a distinction with a difference, because we're talking about the tools you use to do a job. And if we're going to talk about tools, I want to talk about something I've come to refer to as the crayon box principle. Now, the crayon box principle was explained to me one day, in a manner of speaking, during my first job as a reporter and a photographer at a television station in South Dakota. I loved that job. It was the first place that was actually paying me to say, go out and commit journalism for a living. I have to admit I didn't love it that much on the day in question. I'd been sent out into the hinterlands in sub-zero weather, very sub-zero weather. It was about 20 degrees below zero. And I'd been sent out to do a story on the outside repairs to a place called, and this is a real place, the Corn Palace. An event center lined from stem to stern with murals made entirely out of corn, and why not? And I was shooting with gear that was so heavy, and it was so old, I remain convinced to this day that if you cracked open the housing, you'd find a hamster on a flywheel desperately trying to make the whole thing work. I wasn't saving the world with this kind of journalism. I doubt I was saving South Dakota with this kind of journalism. My heart was not in it, and it showed. And when I got back to the station with my footage, my chief photographer let me know that it showed. I, with all the wisdom that can only come from being 22 years old with less than 3 months' experience in the job force, unloaded. I railed against the gear. I railed against the weather. I railed against the story. For good measure, I was rounding back and railing against the gear one more time. And he stopped me. And he put this warm, fatherly hand on my shoulder. And he looked at me with these kind, fatherly eyes. And then he said, listen, jerko, I better be able to send you out there with a box of crayons and know you can come back with a story that can be on my television station. Got it, kid? A box of flippin' crayons. Well, I got it. And not just because I was receiving the R-rated version of the conversation I'm relating to you today. I got it because, darn it, he was right. The tools you use to tell a story, they rank a distant second compared to your passion for doing a job well. So if we're going to have a conversation about the tools, how I do my job, it needs to be more than that. If all I do today is talk about how I use the spatial and the acoustic dimensions of an environment or a set to frame the shot, if all I do is talk about how I shoot twice as many shots at 4 times the resolution in half the time so I can have the volume of shots necessary to tell a story, or how I don't think of color as much as color temperature, and how I use waveforms and vector scopes to craft the mood and the design of a piece, or how I work with a team of dedicated creative professionals so our entire creative vision can be realized when even those tools fail me. If that's all I do, I've committed the cardinal sin in my profession. I've become the story and not the storyteller. And all that happens tonight is that you leave with the novelty of having met the only visually impaired filmmaker you are ever likely to meet in person. And we don't get a lot done. So what are my passions. My passions are the principles of photography, the principles of good storytelling, and I'm pleased to report these principles work. They work for the phone in your pocket. They work for the cameras on my set. They work in your life. I know they work in my life. They have pulled me back from some of those very dim places. Photography principle number 1, action-reaction. Whenever I'm shooting a scene, the first thing I do, I look for the action. Sometimes that action, it may be intense and obvious. It may be small and subtle. But the action is always there. And when you find the action, you find the reaction. And that's my next shot. It tells me where to go. A sailor pulls on the main chute. Sail goes up. Sail goes up. The boat goes. And the story starts to develop. Life principle. Actions have consequences, and so do reactions. It's a never-ending chain of events. But if you don't like the chain of consequences in your life, backtrack. Find new action. Sometimes the action you're looking for, it may be intense and obvious, it may be small and subtle, but it's there. And by changing the action, you can change the flow of your life. Photography principle number 2. Wide shot, medium shot, tight shot. Most photographers, myself included, we don't like to begin a story with the medium shot because the tight shot, the details, that's where the good stuff is. And the details serve in such stark contrast to the wide shot. And both of these extremes enrich and enhance the story in the middle. The look of determination in the tight shot on the face of a man who has spent most of his life in a wheelchair as he, wide shot, crosses the Cook Strait, one of the most dangerous bodies of water in the world, as part of a fleet of disabled sailors. Both of these extremes make understanding and enriching the story in the middle. It creates the sweet spot. Life principle, details matter. And so does the big picture. Understanding what is happening both in and around your life, both extremes, it makes your life that much richer. And photography principle number 3, take the camera where the eye doesn't go. I love my camera. I love putting it in unusual places, shooting from unusual angles, showing different points of view, shifting perspectives. This all results in a series of unique shots and a story that hopefully only I can tell. Life principle, live unbound. We must constantly seek out shifting perspectives. Embrace competing points of view, even if they are points of view we don't agree with. Try something unusual. Hire a blind person. Or anyone you think may be bound by circumstance. I promise you, any obstacle you can think of, the person on the other end of the lens, they have already thought of a way over, around, or through it. I see this every day in the documentary that I'm creating right now. And why on earth would a visually impaired filmmaker call it the Palette Project? Because we are exploring a truism that the best stories in life exist around the rich vibrancy and beyond the rich vibrancy of color and the stories we're finding along the way. From the Red Centre of Australia, where members of that 40,000-year-old Aboriginal culture are banding together with the Australian government for the first time after centuries of strife to preserve sacred sites, and by the way, make them accessible to people of all abilities, to the blue waters off the coast of New Zealand, where a crew of blind sail racers take on all challengers and prove that not only are there no boundaries past the water's edge, they were probably never there in the first place. and the stories yet to come from cutting-edge technologies being developed near the heart of the yellow sands of the Middle Eastern desert, technologies that are enabling the visually impaired to navigate the world even better, to job creation and training centers being created for men and women with disabilities. Remember that 70%. Centers being created footsteps away from the Golden Gate Bridge. There are stories for every color of the painter's palette. And what I like so much about the conversation we're having tonight is that the people here are already there when it comes to this idea of living a life without boundaries. We get it, that the stories of blind sailors and mountain climbers and bicyclists and documentary filmmakers are less amazing and less inspiring every day because there are so many of us. All we're doing is living that life without boundaries. And we can stand here and say with absolute conviction of purpose that even if all you have is a box of crayons, you can still build the best stories of your life. Thank you.